Welcome to this How Do I video on configuring Dynamics NAV 2016 with Azure SQL databases. In this video, we will show how easy it is to deploy your NAV database to an Azure SQL database. Why would you want to do that? Well, it's much easier to let Microsoft manage your databases and servers and provide the backup and restore capabilities. It's much easier when you need to scale up as your business grows. And finally, it's better to pay for what you use and not have excess resources waiting in case they might be needed. So there are some prerequisites for this demonstration. Firstly, you need an Azure subscription. You need to deploy the NAV demo image to an Azure virtual machine. And finally, you need to install SQL Server 2014 Management Studio, and you need at least Service Pack 1 as it has the updated components for the new Azure SQL databases. So we're going to get there today by going through the following steps. Firstly, we're going to create a new Azure SQL server and database. Secondly, we will deploy our NAV database to Azure SQL. And finally, we'll configure our NAV server to use the Azure SQL database. So the first step is to create the new Azure SQL database. And we're going to do this using the new Azure Management Portal. So here's the portal, and I'll go in and select Create a New Object. In this case, I'll choose Database from the list. As you can see, Microsoft Dynamics NAV 2016 is also in the list there of things you can create. I'll give the name for the database. This is actually a blank database. We're only using this in order to create a new server. We'll specify that we're creating a new server, and we'll give it a name, which of course has to be unique, and specify a username and password. And you'll need these when you're configuring the NAV server to connect to the Azure SQL database. Make sure you select the location that's close to where your Azure virtual machine is deployed. In my case, that's Northern Europe. And finally, by allowing access to Azure services, you don't have to set up any special firewall configuration to allow the virtual machine to connect to the SQL server. As I said, we're just going to create a blank database here, and we'll be adding other databases later. We'll select the standard service tier, and we'll also add it to the same resource group that I used when I created my virtual machine. So that's all there is to setting up the SQL Server and database in Azure. So we'll wait for that to deploy, and now we can move on to the next step, which is to deploy the NAV database to Azure SQL. And for this, we'll be using SQL Server Management Studio, which I've installed on my Azure virtual machine. So we'll switch to the virtual machine, and here we can see the NAV administration tool showing the default configuration, which is to use the local SQL Server instance, which we can also see here in SQL Management Studio. And there's the demo database. And what I've done is I've created another database where I've just restored the demo database backup file, which comes with the NAV DVD. And I've done that just so that there's no data in the database, because when I create the backpack, I don't need to worry about extracting and deleting data from the database. If you're working with an existing database, you'll need to run some special scripts, and they're provided on the server. So I'll go and select Export Data Tier Application, and the wizard pops up here telling me I'm going to create a backpack file. I'm going to store it on my Azure Storage account, which I've already entered the key for here. You can get that from the management portal. You could also use a local file. Advantage of using Azure Storage is you can reuse that backpack file to deploy databases to other servers. Give the file a name and start the process. It gives you a summary over the process, and then starts what takes a couple of minutes with the demo database to extract the schema and the data out of the database and put it into the backpack storage file, and then upload that file to the Windows Azure Storage. Now that we've completed the export, we now want to import the data into the database. So we'll now connect to our new Azure SQL database, and currently it has no databases. So we're going to import the data tier application. In this case, this is the backpack file that we just created. Selecting again from our Azure Storage account, and it finds the default file there, which I just created. The next step is to provide a database name. I'm just going to give it a simplified name for demo database here, and of course it's selected the server which we chose before, and I'll reduce the maximum database size to 10 gigabytes as this is only a demo database, and the S0 service level, which is sufficient for our demonstration. You can see you can choose all the other service levels here. Quick summary of what we're doing, and now we'll start the process. And this takes a little bit longer, and now our import is finished. You can see all the green lights there, and we can see the database has been now created on our Azure SQL Server. So to configure the NAV server to use Azure SQL database, we're going to use the Dynamics NAV administration tool. You can also do this using PowerShell, and in fact there are scripts on the demo image showing you how to do this complete process using one big PowerShell script. So it's perfectly possible to automate this. So we're going to just demonstrate the steps here visually using the administration tool and a little bit of PowerShell. I'm going to copy the name of the database from SQL Server Management Studio, so I don't have to type it in again, so I know I've got the right name. Going to edit the server configuration. I'll remove the database instance as that's not needed. There's only a default instance on our Azure SQL Server. Change the name of the server and change the database name to the simplified name that I created before. And the other option here is we want to enable encryption on our SQL Server connection, and that will also require that an encryption key is used when communicating with SQL Server. And we'll see how that gets generated. So now we've set up the database configuration. We need to provide the SQL Server credentials, and they are the credentials we specified when we created our Azure SQL Server. So we edit the database credentials tab here and select SQL Server authentication. Type in the username and password that we entered before, and it reminds us here that you are going to need an encryption key, and it'll only create and deploy that encryption key the first time. It'll also tell us to enable encryption, which we've done. So if you repeat these steps, you'll need to actually import the encryption key into the NAV database. And the final step for us, and I'm going to use PowerShell here to import the NAV license, and now we can see that the database is now running after importing the license file. And we can start the client, and of course it takes a little while to start the first time, but we pretty quickly get a connection to our new Azure SQL NAV database. As an alternative to creating and deploying the Azure SQL database manually, you can also use the demo scripts that are provided on the NAV Azure Gallery image. The first script to run is the initialize virtual machine script. This makes the virtual machine accessible from the internet. It creates SSL certificates, sets up NAV user password authentication, and opens up the required ports for the services. So, to begin with, when you've set up the virtual machine, you get the landing page. And there you can open the demo environment folder. Demo environment folder, you just right-click Initialize Virtual Machine and run with PowerShell. And it'll then prompt you for the necessary parameters. When that's complete, you get the new landing page, which has all the links for the demonstration environment so that you can access it for clients on the internet. The next step is to deploy to Azure SQL databases using the script use Azure SQL databases. And this does all the work we've been through. It creates the backpack file from the local database, creates an Azure SQL server, restores the backpack to Azure SQL, creating a new database, and configures NAV to use the Azure SQL database. So by using this script, you can do all the steps that we've demonstrated. You do that by, again, starting from the demonstration environment folder and running the script. Use Azure SQL database, using PowerShell, and then providing all the parameters required by the script. So here's a summary of what we've done during this video. We created a new Azure SQL database and server. We deployed our NAV demo database to the Azure SQL Server that we created, and then we configured our NAV server to connect to Azure SQL Server. Here's some resources that might help you doing this, particularly the MSDN topic on how to deploy Dynamics NAV database to Azure SQL databases, and also the topic on how to configure the SQL Server authentication, which covers the encryption keys that you might need to set up. Thank you for watching this video about deploying NAV databases to Azure SQL. This video was created in collaboration with Microsoft and the Training Center Platan.